So the first presentation that we've got is entitled Post-Grenfell, the Situation So Far. And it'll be looking at the Building Safety Bill and its implications, and the three questions really. What must you do now? What must you not do now? Can be equally as important. And who signs off what? What processes are coming into place? This particular session is going to be a 15-minute joint session. So a few slides there as talking points, and then it'll be a 15-minute Q&A session. So as I said, start your questions rolling and we'll pick those up. Our speakers are Colin Blatchford, Operational Policy Lead at the Health and Safety Executive, and Mark Wilson, Operational Lead, Planning Gateway 1, Building Safety Regulator. You have all their biographies in front of you. I wish to welcome both of them. They're going to share this presentation. Colin, you'll see, has worked in building control profession for over 30 years. He's also a great friend to certainly the RIBA and the RICS, because he's been involved in technical training and CPD with them over the years. Mark joined the Health and Safety Executive in 2021, and he leads a team of five fire safety specialists who are implementing the changes that were recommended by the Independent Review of Building Regulations and Fire Safety by Dame Judith Hackett. And that was set up, if you remember, just before the Grenfell inquiry itself. And she reported very swiftly after being commissioned is the wrong word, invited to review the building regulations process. And her reports are very important reading. So without more ado, let me welcome Colin and Mark and hand over to them for their presentation. Colin and Mark.
The Building Safety Act, now implemented, sets up a building safety regulator, as you're all aware. And before I hand over to Mark to discuss the Planning Gateway 1 elements of the new regulatory framework, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of the three main functions of the regulator. I'll start in reverse order because it is important to consider that the regulator has a remit across the whole of the built environment. So in terms of its role in oversight of the wider system for regulating both the safety and performance of all buildings. And that includes the regulator setting up a new building advisory committee, which will be advising on information to the BSR in the exercise of all of its functions across all of its scope. And amongst other things, it will be setting up a new regulated building control profession, setting operational standards rules for both the public and the private sector of the building control profession. So there's a broad remit there across quite a lot of the built environment. The second element is promoting competence for all buildings. And we'll talk a little bit more about competence in my part of the session. But this is about ensuring that both, all elements of the industry, professionals, architects, designers, tradespeople, contractors, building control professionals working on all buildings are suitably competent and have the organisational capability to deal with buildings and design and construction competently. So that again broadens the scope of the regulator's function. And then finally, the new higher risk building regulatory framework, which we're going to talk in a bit more detail on in the rest of the session. This is where we focus on those buildings that are higher risk buildings, that are currently over 18 metres in height or at least 7 stories and have 2 or more residential units. And that will introduce a series of additional regulatory functions, both for in-occupation through the safety case regime and also the creation of the BSR as the building control authority for HRBs and, of course, Planning Gateway 1. All of this is to, in essence, change the attitude, behaviour and culture across the whole of the built environment, as identified by Dame Judith, and to ensure that the regulator is both proportionate in its actions and in its functions, is evidence-led, and with the functional aim to re-establish confidence in the system so that residents are safe and feel safe in their homes. So that's a broad overview of the regulator's broader function, and it's quite considerable. There's an awful lot there I could cover. I'll pass on to Mark now, who will talk about the planning gateway 1 aspect, and then I'll come back in to discuss the wider building regulations elements. Mark.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, my background is I'm a town planner, and I was brought in to lead the Planning Gateway 1 team at HSE. And the Planning Gateway 1 sort of regime, as if you want to call it that, was brought forward, was established on the 1st of August 2021, and it was able to be brought forward before the BSR proper, as it were. So it was brought forward ahead of the Building Safety Act because it involved alterations to existing planning legislation, which established HSE as a new statutory consultee for relevant buildings. And Colin's just explained what a relevant building is there. The policy intent behind it was really to bring forward consideration of fire safety matters as they relate to land use planning, and this was a key recommendation that was set out in Dame Judith Hackett's report, which was published in May 2018. This first slide here, the approach to fire safety, it identifies the sort of dynamic that I observed when I first arrived on the scene as the leader for Planning Gateway 1. And as a planner, I'd never had much involvement in building regulations. It was something that we passed on to the next stage in the process. But my observation is that there was little or no consideration that was given to fire safety in the design of residential buildings at the planning stage. So the design that was presented in planning applications, I'm sure there was some elements of fire safety design in that, but essentially it led to a situation where fire safety design problems got baked in once the planning permission was granted. And this then created a momentum to the design that then other statutory consultees at the building regulation stage, so fire and rescue services, for example, found very difficult to get traction for their concerns at that stage because, to a large extent, the design was fixed. The layout, the appearance, and the interactions with between things like fire cores and different parts of the building and uses were all established at the planning stage. So that ultimately led to a situation where we were relying on very complex and costly fire engineered solutions at the building regulation stage. It's sort of akin to putting makeup on a pig, basically. That's what I've often described it as. But and these fire engineered solutions, I mean, some of them were probably relying far too much on what I would call bells and whistles, when they could have been the risks that were presented by the design could have been designed out at an earlier stage. And then ultimately, if things were needing to change as a result of assessment at at the building regulation stage, this quite often generated further planning applications to resolve those issues. Because they involved changes that were material to the design of the building itself. So our since August, we've been assessing planning applications that are referred to us for developments that include a relevant building, and this is essentially our how we've it's a graph which shows the level of concerns that we've been raising month to month since January, when January really represented the first sort of business as usual sort of month following the sort of ramp up of the regime from the August previously. But essentially what you can see there is so the grey box and the yellow box and the blue box, grey box and above, basically shows the number of concerns that we've raised on planning applications, and that represents roughly about, well, the current tally is roughly about 66% of all planning applications that are referred to us that we're raising concerns about. Some of the concerns we're raising can be easily resolved, others are more fundamental. But it does demonstrate that that problem that I was explaining before about fire safety issues getting baked in at the planning stage if there's no intervention, as Dame Judith asked for there to be. Now this might be familiar to a lot of you. It's the REBA plan of works. Quite often when we're raising concerns at the planning stage, we're being told you're getting into the weeds too soon, there's too much detail here, these are the matters that can be dealt with at the building regulations stage, and they quite often refer us to the REBA plan of works. So the applicant will go have a look at the REBA plan of works, where this shouldn't be being considered right now. We look at the REBA plan of works, and I don't know how clear it is for you to see there, but planning happens under spatial coordination stage 3, and at the bottom there where that blue box is pointing, it says review your planning application against building regulations. So there's clearly an intention for fire standards to be considered and for applications to be reviewed against them as part of the REBA plan of works. So that demonstrates that actually best practice is reflecting or chiming very strongly with what we're actually doing in Planning Gateway 1. And this slide here is just to identify some of the typical design concerns that we're raising. I'd say about 70% of all of the concerns we're raising relate to tall buildings with single staircases. And we're well aware that currently fire standards and building regulations allow tall buildings to have single staircases, but with that comes if that's a designed choice that's been made, that comes with compromises that need to be made, and these design concerns that we raise are typical of some of the compromises that might need to be made. So here we have a design that we reviewed. It was for a very tall building. It was 46 stories high. I've anonymised it for to save blushes from anyone who's worked on it or the developer. But essentially, you can see the single stair core. You can see that it connects directly with a bin store to the left of it. It also connects directly to this is a basement, by the way. It also connects directly to a maintenance store, and it also, by a slightly more convoluted route, connects directly to a covered car park. These are all areas of high fire risk, and bear in mind that single staircase is the only means of escape for people in upper stories, and it's the only access for firefighters. Essentially, that fire core should not go down into a basement if it's a single stair. There should be a separate access into any basement area if it's a single stair. So that fire core there should have terminated at the ground floor level. It shouldn't even be on this floor plan for the basement, and it demonstrates really the common concerns that have been raised. The issue for us is we quite often will raise these concerns and then we'll get fire engineers or client team, design teams saying, well, we'll lobby these areas off, and that's not suitable in a single stair building. It doesn't comply with the fire standards either. If you've got a single stair, lobbying and smoke ventilation is generally not acceptable as a means of protecting that fire stair. And that's because a firefighting team will go down into that basement, and they will, no matter how many fire doors you've got, they will jam them all open with charged fire hoses to fight any fire in the bin store or the covered car park or whatever. And that will expose the fire shaft to fire, heat and smoke. And bear in mind the fact that this fire shaft is life critical. That's just not acceptable. And we're taking a far less tolerant view of these sort of design features. In the past, these sort of designs have gone through the planning process, and we're deliberately taking a more stringent approach, and we're providing a sort of foretaste of what a more stringent regime is going to look and feel like as the different parts of the building safety regulator are stood up in the next 18 months to 2 years. So over to you, Colin.
Thank you, Mark. I think before I move on to the what is different and what you are going to have to do in terms of the new regulatory framework. It's important to highlight actually that there is a new set of secondary legislation, and these will be published in due course, which complement the Building Safety Act. There are approximately 34 or thereabouts pieces of secondary legislation that are due to be issued in short order, and probably in the next 3 to 4 months, maybe a little bit longer. One of the most important elements is this one, the Building Appointment of Persons, Industry Competence and Duty Holders, England regulations. And this applies to the whole built environment. And as I said right at the outset, the sort of second function of the regulator is to oversee and promote competence of industry professionals, and that's you. And so this applies to everybody that has either a design or a construction role, a contracting role within the built environment, not just limited to HRBs. And it's important to note that actually these form part of the building regulations. So they are an element that can be enforced against if you are not competent in the work that you undertake. So it's really important to understand these. And it imposes those legal requirements on clients, on duty holders in terms of designers, and those that are undertaking actual building work. So it's really, really critical as part of the overall culture change, I suppose, that you must appoint the right people who are competent to do the job you're asking them to do right from the outset. So we'll refer back to a little bit about enforcement and other things as we go through. There's not many slides, you'll be pleased to hear. The next one is where I'm going to spend the focus of my time. But this, in context, is the most important thing. It increases that sort of more rigor and demanding duty holder roles within the design and construction process. So you need to make sure that the people you use are competent for what you're asking them to do. So what is different in the functional statutory requirements for approvals? Who signs off what? I think the most contentious question I'm going to ask is, well, who signs off what now? And I would contend that starts with you as designers. It's your responsibility, along with all of the other people involved in the building regulations and design and construction process, to ensure that the functional requirements are complied with. And that rests with you. It's the person undertaking the work that has that responsibility. Now, the regulator will have a role within that process. And the role within that process is going to change for higher risk buildings quite considerably to the current building control approval process that you are well used to. The difference? Well, the difference isn't the guidance. I mean, the approved documents and British standards, they're in a constant state of change and update. So the elements of those guidance documents, those fire safety standards, will change, but the functional requirements haven't changed. What does change is the timing, the creation of hard stop points in the process, and the need for you as designers and contractors and clients to actually be prepared to plan, manage and monitor the projects you have at the right times. So, for example, we move from what Mark was discussing on Planning Gateway 1, getting those early designs suitable for the building you're designing, considered appropriately at the right stage at the planning application process. We then move into the building control process. And at the moment, the system allows you to submit an application and then to commence work and to sort out the approval as almost as you go along. That's no longer going to be the case. And the regulator will be introducing a hard stop point at the building control approval application stage, where without that regulator approval, you will not be able to commence work on your higher risk building. It is a gateway in the truest sense. And that gateway will be your opportunity for you to tell the regulator how your designs will deliver a safe building, meet the functional requirements of the building regulations, and be able to be transferred to the construction phase of the development. So what we're not looking for is anything necessarily different to what you're already doing. You are already hopefully designing safe, compliant buildings. What we're looking for at the Gateway 2 stage is for you to tell us that, and provide evidence, the plans, the details, the information, to demonstrate how you've provided that building to be compliant with the functional requirements and the building regulations. So that's the key change. Through construction into the completion phase, obviously these larger, higher risk buildings take a little longer than some run-of-the-mill buildings. But that's the opportunity for you, again, as a designer or contractor, to actually provide and gather the evidence to demonstrate to the regulator at Gateway 3 that what you have built is both in accordance with the design that was approved at Gateway 2, i.e. a compliant and safe building, and therefore all the way through the construction process, and this is part of that golden thread of information which is talked about, is you have gathered the evidence through that process to be able to demonstrate to the regulator at the completion end of the project that you've actually built what you said you were going to build. So you have told us at the beginning that your design will deliver a safe building. You've then evidenced at the end that you've built what you said you were going to. And if you make changes along the way, and there are some key elements of change control that we could spend a lot of time on, but essentially if you change elements of design, you might need to get that reapproved. If you change materials or products, you will need to record or notify the regulator of those elements. For certain critical elements, you'll certainly need to notify, but you need that suitable change control procedure within your process throughout. At that completion stage, you're again going to present that information, that golden thread of information, to the regulator. The regulator is going to be, working with you throughout the whole process. Of course, we're not going to be an arm's length body which just comes in at the end and says no. We want to be very much part of that process, but you're going to be providing the evidence to show how you've actually constructed what you said you were going to, and that we are then assured that the building is safe to move forward to the occupation phase. And importantly, here, there's the Gateway 3. Now you'll see to the right-hand side of the slide that actually you won't be able to progress to registration of your higher risk building without the regulator issuing you with a completion certificate. So there won't be any chance of occupying that building until you've both registered and achieved a completion certificate from the regulator. So that's going to require a little bit more planning and managing and monitoring through the construction process, and discussion with the regulator as you come to that completion and moving into the occupation phase. And I think it's important for us to just stress that the overall aim here is to end up with a safe building to live in, a safe building to use, and preceding that, a safe building to construct. So you can actually demonstrate to the regulator and yourselves that you have a safe product to move forward. And it's important to remember that these buildings are considered as systems. They are complex systems. So thinking about the end process, that end-to-end from design to occupation and in-occupation management, is really important. You've got to take those factors into consideration at the earliest stage of design. In terms of planning Gateway 1, are we building any problems into this design by not considering perhaps how the building might be used, or its occupancy, or particular uses or risks that have been established early on? Have you recorded those through the golden thread of information? Do you understand those risks? How might they be affected by other changes you might make? And it's important to stress that the ownership of those risks really rests with the client, the design team, the contractors. It shouldn't rely on the regulator to come in and say you've done something wrong. That evidence base is you telling the regulator this is correct and this is my evidence to demonstrate it's correct. So that collaboration, which I know is part of the next session, is critical in all of this, making sure you've got the right people at the right time, involved in the design, involved in the construction, and involved in that dialogue with the regulator to make sure you have sufficient controls to manage the construction process, the right competencies of people delivering those elements of the construction, and then making sure that if things change, because inevitably they do, that the regulator is notified and suitable reapproval is given at the right times. That, I'm sure there'll be a few questions on that. I just wanted to move on in terms of the timelines and where we are looking. Hopefully, yep, there's the next slide. This is a little bit smaller on my screen, but essentially the Planning Gateway 1 is a live function. The register for higher risk buildings is due to open in April next year, 2023, with a 6-month window for existing buildings to be registered. And then from October 2023, the new building control function within the regulator starts and commences. So that's the time from which the existing building control system will no longer exist for HRBs. Any HRB, both in terms of new build, significant alterations, adding stories, recladding, and other changes of use, will come to the regulator as the default building control authority. So that's when the gateways kick off and commence, and therefore that moves forward through to construction. There will, I think, be some transitional provisions for buildings that might be on that cusp of the new regulations coming in, which will be confirmed in due course. And then we also open the registers for registered building inspectors and the transition from approved inspectors to registered building control approvers, plus a number of other functions start to turn on in April 2024. The operational standards rules for all building control bodies, for example, will kick in, and the requirement to be a registered building inspector to undertake work across the whole built environment and elements of the registers will start to become absolute. I hope that gives you a bit of a flavour. I'm looking at the timeline thinking we're almost spot on time. I'm sure there might be some questions that both Mark and I will do our best to answer. And on that note, I'll hand back to Paul.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed for that, Colin. There's a lot of questions in there actually that automatically come to the fore, but also we've got questions rolling in here. I've got a couple that I want to ask, but I'm going to leave those to the end so that we get straight into delegates. And I've got one here, which is a question for Mark, and if you, I'll just read it out. Can Mark confirm if the HSE concerns typically raised at planning stage, for example, the single stair communicating directly to the bin store, goodness me, are correctly expressed within the regulations, i.e., are they examples of architects not reviewing the regulations? Or if they are additional to building regulations, and if they're additional, where should architects be looking to ensure that they find these and design them out? Now, this takes us straight into a rich question, which is how much training is necessary in the schools of architecture so that when architects graduate and go into offices, they are familiar with these issues and never forget them, so that at concept stages, buildings are being designed not to the regulations, but with a good knowledge of the regulations. I think there's been a drift in that respect, so we'd like your views on that for Liam.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I should have really said was a way forward is really for a much more collaborative approach to be adopted at the earliest stages of the design process, and that includes architects and fire engineers working together. Now, my observation is that usually a fire engineer will be parachuted in at the last minute to, as I described before, put makeup on a pig. But in fire safety design terms, I don't think it's necessarily, with everything else an architect has to consider, I don't think it's necessarily reasonable for them to have a detailed knowledge of fire standards. I think there's some basic things that they could usefully be aware of going into the design process. That issue to do with single stairs and what you can and can't connect to is probably one of them.
Let me interrupt you. Let me interrupt you there, if I may, because I think Liam would want to come back on that and say, yes, fine, got it. But, big question, we've talked about the need for a change in culture. What was wrong with the old culture? Well, plenty, obviously. What's needed in the new culture? Where does this change take place? Because I get it from what you said. We can't overload courses when architects are trained with all the thousands of other things they've got to do, and all other members of the construction industry as well. But at the same time, this culture, a culture of responsibility, a culture of awareness that our work at its bottom line is about people being able to enjoy buildings, have their spirits lifted by being in buildings, but be safe in buildings. That's got to be crucial. So where do we get this cultural change?
Can I jump in there, Paul, if I may?
Yeah, please do.
I think that, our observation is that there perhaps has been an over-reliance on the building control process to pick up these issues through at sort of quite late stages in the design process. So I think in terms of a cultural change, it's working out that those who create the risk should own the risk. So I think you're right. There is an element of understanding the principles that are attached to the design of these kind of buildings, and all buildings actually. But understanding the principles is the first step. And maybe the answer to that question is that, yeah, there needs to be a little bit more work done on those underlying principles to ensure that people are competent to ask the right questions at the right stages. So you can't expect every architect to know every paragraph in approved document B. But what you can do is expect them to understand the principles, so that when something is presented, when something is put forward as a design, as a concept, that concept and principle can be immediately identified as, that's not quite right, I now need to go and look into that into more detail. So it's understanding that principle to be able to then go back and review, as opposed to just expecting the building control officer to pick up the problem. Does that kind of answer the question?
On the way, but we'll probe that a bit further. Just one for you to bear in mind. I don't think we can have an answer on it, but it's worth just pointing out. Kim Betts, will we be considering discussing the Scottish regulations too? Well, we haven't got time to open that big issue up, but just a marker, there are different regulations around the UK, and we do need to be deeply aware of that. Now, you said, in describing the gateways 2 and 3, that it's important that you tell us at Gateway 2 how the building's safe, you tell us at the end how it's safe, and then you tell us what changes have taken place on the way. If I got that right. Who is the you? Who is you? Tell us. We've got a construction team, we've got a client. Who's the you in this?
I think it's everybody. I would say it's both the contractors, the designers, and the client to be aware of their obligations and duties. And it is that understanding, that collaborative working. And I think it's understanding the competence across the whole of the process. Everybody has their element of skill sets, and understanding those changes that might affect a fire strategy, or might affect the structural design, or the access provision. And we're talking about all aspects of the building regulations here. We're not just focusing on fire and structure. So it's understanding that, minor changes can have a significant impact to quite a few elements of building regulations compliance. So the you is the audience here, understanding that they need to.
I've got that, but I'll just leave it as a big open question. Okay, but you don't want the new regulator, building safety regulator, isn't going to want a whole range of commentaries uncoordinated from everybody involved in the project. That's going to have to be wrapped together, brought together, fed through in some organised way. Now, we've got a question here from Stuart Taylor. How with increased legal duties should the construction professionals be monitoring works on site? And that is, again, critical, because we've got your third part, which is tell us about the changes that you've made. But of course, many of those changes get made on site through site instructions. They can be big changes as well. So what about the site side of it?
Yeah, this is critical as part of the overall process. So within the new secondary legislation, and you'll see it as part of the consultation that the department has just closed, actually, there are a set of prescribed documents, and one of which is the change control plan. So that is from the outset, how are you going to manage change? How are you going to record change? What are you going to do when significant changes occur that have an effect on your design, your strategies, your approach to compliance? And that's the most critical document. That's where that golden thread of information will feed from. The evidence to support what you've built actually meets what you said you were, what your design actually shows. and that you have delivered and constructed a compliant and safe building. So that construction control plan is critical.
Okay. I submitted, as an architect, a description of the building in terms of fire safety as part of a planning application only recently. It was a high-risk building. We're having to learn all these new acronyms as well, HRB. But the interesting thing there was that the planning officer said, well, I don't know how to deal with this because I've got a geography degree and we're planners, we don't understand about fire. So the question there is, if it's the right thing to do, and there's a question in my mind about that, but if it is the right thing to do to involve the planning department in these discussions, how are they supposed to respond when their training and background is entirely different? Are they expected to pass it to the building regs department, which is what this planning officer said they were doing? Oh, we're passing your stuff to the building regs people. Or are they expected to hire a new kind of planner who has experience of fire safety planning in buildings?
Yeah, I mean, I have some sympathy with the point there, but I think ultimately that's why HSE has been brought in to be a statutory consultee for these buildings, and we can certainly provide advice that they can then, as planners, they can bring in their building control colleagues to advise them. But I mean, we're a team that's made up of. I'm the only planner in the team. The rest of the team are fire specialists, fire engineers. So there's definitely a case for better understanding of fire safety issues, and that will have to be something that will happen anyway. Because, for example, the London plan has now policies in it directly related to fire safety and design.
Well, that question was prompted by Matthew Locke, so we got that one away. There's many more questions here. I hope I've done justice to the range of them, but there's many more. But we're going to have to bring it to a close because we've got to count down of 14, 13, 12 seconds and into the next session. It's just time for me to thank you on behalf of the AJ and everybody else for this start. Very good platform for us to move on throughout what I've said already is going to be a very interesting day. Thank you both.
Thank you.